Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Cheaper Than Therapy. Vanessa and I are geeking out, excited about today's guest. Dr. Joy, just been such a fan of what you're doing. Such important work in the world for so long. Thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with us today.
No, it is a pleasure to join you. And Danae, I want to thank you specifically for your support. I feel like you were a very early member of the Therapy for Black Girls Therapist Directory. And so I'm very, very honored to chat with you.
Oh my God, I'm like giddy that you know that. It just like that just made my heart explode. Can I just tell you, I was telling Vanessa before you came on, I was like, first of all, I think what you have done for, well, certainly women of color, but like, for like the destigmatizing of mental health, just such a pioneer. I think it's so important. I'm a therapist who still people in my family will be like, and you work with all those crazy people. I'm like, I don't know how many
Sigh.
times we have to have the conversation that we don't call people crazy. But I think what I was saying to Vanessa is there is still in 2024 so much stigmatization around seeking support for our mental health and really being real about how I'm doing really. And I think you have done so much work to change that and to normalize being in therapy and talking about the fact that you're in therapy. So thank you for that, truly.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such important work, right? I do think that we've come a long way, I think, in
Mhm.
terms of like decreasing stigma, but there's still so much work to be done.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And shout out to our friend Inertia, because she's the one that actually originally turned us on to your work so long ago, right? 2020, 2019.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I
And
remember her
so
name as well. I mean, I
I
think it's
can't
funny. We probably
believe
will get in. Yeah, so we probably will get into this at some point, but because I was like the one managing the directory, like I was the one approving all of
Yep.
the profiles. And so I remember people's names. I may not remember your face, but I remember lots of names.
mind blown by your mind,
I know,
first of
seriously, that
all.
memory.
Like, can you tell how taken back I am that you know that?
Yeah,
I'm
because
like,
Inertia's last name is it DeWitt?
It is.
Yep.
this woman's
I
great.
know, right?
Oh
Shout
my
out to
God.
Inertia.
That is like,
Shout out to you, Inertia, for putting us
you're,
on.
oh my God.
She's going to be
Wow.
giddy when she hears this.
That is incredible. Well, will you take us back to how you made the decision for those who aren't familiar with your work and therapy for Black girls and everything that you've done? Will you take us back a little bit with how you made the decision to start everything that you're doing now, how it came to fruition?
Yeah, so I feel like I have to start before therapy for Black girls. So my background is actually in college student mental health, and I would run groups for the Black women students on campus, on every campus that I was on, because of the stigma that we've already talked about, right? And so it felt important to have a place where people could like meet somebody from the counseling center and realize like, oh, I can go and talk with them about like regular kinds of things. And so I feel like I was kind of doing therapy for Black girls before it had the name Therapy for Black Girls, but it actually started in 2014 after I watched Black Girls Rock on BET. So it's
Oh.
an award show, and it just like in my living room, I could feel the energy that was in that room. It was just such a
Mm.
beautiful celebration of like Black women celebrating with one another and like honoring each other for the important work they were doing in the world. And I thought, wow, it would be really cool to capture like some of this same energy for Black women related to mental health. And so I
Mm.
jumped on GoDaddy that night and purchased the domain therapyforblackgirls.com. And I started it as a blog. So I was just
Mm.
blogging about like how do you find a therapist and like how do you lean into your support system, like general kinds of mental health topics. And
Mm.
then in 2017, I added both the podcast and the therapist directory. And I added the directory because I spent a lot of time on social media, probably way more than I need to be. But I kept seeing all these conversations about people looking for Black women therapists. And I was like, why is there not a place where like we can easily find these people? And so it started as a Google Doc. And what I would do is people who were Black women who had had good experiences with therapists kind of nominated their therapists. And then I compiled them all in terms of states. And like it was just a Google Doc, thing to use. And so fast forward to 2024, we now have over 6,000 therapists across the country and in Canada. So it has really, really taken off. And then the podcast, my husband actually has a background in radio production. And so I started listening to a bunch of podcasts. So before Therapy for Black Girls was my full time job, I was the director of the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University and had like a 45-minute commute each way. And so I listened to a bunch of podcasts and I was like, oh, this might be a cool thing to do for mental health. Like I could, add some information to the blog about, podcast conversations. And and I knew I had a ready-made editor. So I was like, this doesn't feel like it'll be too hard to do. Now, of course, on the other end, I'm sure, as you know, it sounds really easy to the listener, but there are hours of work. Yes, hours of work that go behind making this seem really seamless. And so the podcast just took off. I think that the community just was really primed and ready for the kinds of conversations that we talk about. And so some of the episodes are solo episodes, but most of the episodes are actually me in conversation with another therapist or another expert talking about the kinds of things that impact Black women's health, and Black women's mental health in particular. And so it really has just kind of taken off. And, again, I think the community was just really ready to have a lot of these conversations about mental health.
Mm. That. So I feel like I have some thoughts or ideas, but what would you say are some of the more common themes that impact Black women's mental health versus other communities?
So I think the stigma is a huge part, right? Like many of us have not come from families where it has been okay to talk with a therapist. Many of us grew up with the idea of what goes on in this house stays in this house. So the idea that you would talk to a stranger about some very, very private information is very, very foreign. And I think we also have to kind of pay attention to the ways that mental health has typically been weaponized against
That's right.
communities of color. Like it has not always been safe for Black people and other people of color to actually reach out for help. So I think that the stigma is something that still impacts us. I think also Black women are largely socialized to kind of be martyrs and to kind of take on the needs of everybody else in their circles and not pay attention to their own. And so I think for a lot of us, we will go and go and go until we cannot go anymore. And then we look up and realize, like, wow, I'm not feeling well, or I've really run out of steam. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the superwoman syndrome and feeling like we can
Mm.
take on the weight of the world without actually paying attention to ourselves.
Mm.
Yeah, as you say that, it's so layered because it's like a lot of the struggles that you're talking about aren't things that are just in our minds or things that it's like we have put these things on ourselves and they're self-imposed. Like the superwoman syndrome within Black women is a lot of times as a result of things like the prison industrial complex and the fact that, like, in so many ways, Black women have been doing all of the
All of
things
it.
by themselves because a lot of times the men in our community have been incarcerated or these things have been weaponized in various specific ways by white supremacy. And I think it's interesting, because I think it's how we get beyond what we have had to do to keep ourselves safe. I was thinking about when you were talking about the stigmatization, how much so much of what I talk with my Black female clients about is like allowing myself to be a hot mess, and that is just so, like, even for me now, that is hard to put down, like, the model minority, like, you don't air your dirty laundry, you don't be a hot mess out in these streets, like, it's still hard. I find myself like, nope, you're okay, suck it up, stop. There's
Hmm.
what I think my mother used to say, like, crying doesn't solve anything, things like
Mm.
that are just so, like, my visceral first
Ingrained.
response. So how do you combat those things when they come up in terms of, like, yeah, this is like deeply ingrained in the way that I've been conditioned to move through the world?
Yeah, I think the first step is acknowledging it and acknowledging where it comes from, right? Like, I think a lot of
Mm.
us have been taught that because, like you said, survival. Like, there's a reason why you have been taught, don't look like what you've been through, kind of thing, right?
Mm.
Because the idea was that respectability politics, of course, comes into play here. That if you present a certain way, then you'll be treated better, which means that, you may actually survive to get home. And so
Mhm.
there's a reason why a lot of this has kind of proliferated in our community, but I think we have to stop and ask ourselves, like, is this thinking and are these behaviors and attitudes still helpful to us? I mean, I think it could be argued that it never really was. But I think we have to think about, like, okay, these things that we have been taught, are they actually serving us well today? And I think the answer is no.
I love that.
Yeah, I think too, Danae and I talk frequently about how, I would say women broadly, especially women of color, but women broadly, that so many of the struggles that we're dealing with now currently are kind of ingrained survival tactics, right? And so to use that word layered, like you did, Danae, it's hard because you have to unpack so many layers because yes, I might be holding on to this, let's say, maladaptive kind of way of living in the world, but understanding that this is a deeply ingrained survival tactic that has been passed down generations of women, right? It's not as easy as just learning a new way of being and letting it go. I mean, we're talking about generations of trauma, right?
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, many, we through our training, we know that we cannot expect to take something away from a client without offering them something else and to hold
That's
on
right.
to. And that's a lot of work. That's not something that is going to be cleared up in like 1 or 2 sessions. That's long standing work.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. So I was just thinking about a particular client, as you said, this thing of taking something away without replacing it with something else. And I think so often what I find is still alive, and I think this is to Vanessa's point, still alive in so many communities, but certainly with my sisters, I find that there's like such a desire to keep up the highlight reel. And
Mm.
oh my gosh, the thing of like, I'm not married, I'm a woman of a certain age, and it's just like, and I'm like, no, this is our resistance, sister. Like, you don't have to be married. You don't need a ring on your finger. And they're like, yeah, today that's great. And all my girlfriends are getting married and I want a ring on my finger, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm thinking about like, what do I replace that with? Certainly, like for me, it feels like the empowering reframe, but I think it doesn't always feel that way when you're comparing yourself to those around you, and you want the thing you've been conditioned to want, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we have to start with, and I'm sure you do, like sitting with the empathy of like, wow, it sucks to not have this
It
thing that we
does.
have been told that if we do all the things right, like you get it, like the partnership is like the cherry on top after you like take all of these steps. And so it does really suck to have grown and thought that, okay, this thing is going to happen and then not actually happen. And so I think we have to start with like the grief around
Grief.
what it might
Mhm.
mean to let go of this idea of what you thought you wanted your life to be like or what you thought it would be like, and how do we make space for it actually looking something like something different. So
Mhm.
the acceptance part I think is really hard to get to, but it's okay to allow people to grieve that and to kind of I think join them in the suckiness of thinking your life would be one way and it actually not being that way.
Yeah, that's an important point, Dr. I'm like, no,
I,
ladies, this is our resistance. You're like, Danae, they can grieve.
I
You
know.
have a minute.
I'm sitting here looking at today like, yeah, give it
I'm
to her,
like,
Dr. Joy. Give it
yeah,
to her.
that's
She's,
fair. They get to grieve.
today's all
I'll
like to
give
sit
them a
in that.
minute.
Give him a beat
But
today. Give him a beat.
But I think, as you say that, that's real. And I think this is, not to beat a dead horse a little bit, but I think that this is something that is so alive for Black women so often is this thing of like, I've done all the things. I have
Mhm.
achieved so much. I went to school. I did everything I was told. And I just really feel like I'm struggling to find love and
Yeah.
relationships. And that's something that I talk a lot about, like negotiating this desire that we've been conditioned to have around this. And what do I do when that's not here? How do I
Mhm.
still feel like I am enjoying my life and thriving and not sort of like on hold until I find this person? Because another thing that comes up a lot with my clients is like, and I want to be with a Black man. Like, I'm not
Mhm.
interested in dating outside of my race. And so it sometimes feels, and especially like in LA, maybe not in Atlanta. I feel like maybe there might be more options. I don't know. But that, I just feel like my options are limited and it feels like defeating.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that that's very real, and I do think that it is appropriate then to have conversations about what it looks like to expand your dating pool, right? Because I
Mhm.
think there's nothing wrong with people wanting partnership, like that. That there's nothing bad inherently about that, but I think it is. Can you be open to the partner looking in and coming in a package that you had not expected?
Mhm.
And if it does mean that you're single, then what other ways do we fill your life so that you still feel worthy and fulfilled and whole, even if there is not a partner there?
I love that.
Mhm.
So good.
Can I ask too? I mean, I guess it's a little bit of a left turn, but when I'm thinking back to when therapy for Black girls really kind of, I guess, exploded, do you feel like the kind of mental health crisis that we were seeing across the board in 2020? Do you feel like that was really a catalyst for it taking off the way that it did? Like the timing of it seemed almost too
Mhm.
perfect for it to kind of explode, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everybody was hurting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the first explosion was actually in 2017 when we added the
Okay.
podcast in the
Yeah.
directory. And then by then we had been doing so much work by 2020 when the pandemic happened that it felt like a go-to resource. And of course, everybody was having conversations about mental health. I still think that we are not really dealing with the mental health impact and the fallout of the pandemic. Like there's
Mhm.
just so much. I was actually talking with my own therapist about this yesterday. Like, I feel like something broke for a lot of
Yes.
people during the
Yes.
pandemic, and I don't think we've had time to actually slow down to really focus on like what happened there and like this shared collective trauma that we experienced. Like, I don't think we've done a good job of actually dealing with.
What do you think that is? Like, I mean, I'm sure you've thought about it. Like, when you say something broke, like, what? I mean, I feel like I have my probably idea, and Danae does too. But what do you think that was? Like, what
Yeah.
broke?
I think that for one, there was like such heightened levels of anxiety that were off the charts that like people
Mhm.
didn't even have like strategies to manage. And I
Mhm.
also think we generally don't do a good job of like dealing with our own mortality. And
Mhm.
mortality was so in our face during
That's it.
that time that I think people just weren't even able to grasp like I could leave my house and go to the grocery store and 2 weeks later be terminally ill. Like I think people just could
Mhm.
not wrap their minds around that. And I think that is what has led to us kind of seeing like this in some ways like much more aggressive behavior I think that we're seeing. And like it just feels
Mhm.
like there are no filters largely anymore. And I think a lot of that was people kind of having to come to grips with mortality and not having the resources to actually do that.
Mm.
That's so interesting. I was thinking too, the extent to which in Black communities, especially in Atlanta, I feel like the Black church is such a part of where we put some of our, I don't know,
Like our
existential
anxieties.
angst and
Yeah.
like fears around our mortality. And for so many people, the church was taken away. And I'm
Mhm.
curious to hear your thoughts on that balance between church and like mental health. Cause I feel like sometimes I see within Black communities, there can be a little bit like, just like those things are meant to be at odds with one another. I'm
Yeah.
thinking of people in my family who are like, I don't need therapy.
Hmm.
I got
Need
God. And it's
church. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
But how
definitely
do you
think
speak to that?
yeah, yeah. I definitely think we cannot unintertwine like the relationship between faith and spirituality in Black communities. I think again, it has largely been like a saving grace for a lot of people. It was a lifeline, I think,
Mhm.
for lots of us. And I'm very encouraged to see more faith communities doing more with mental health. Like I think a lot of churches have like mental health ministries and like there are counselors on staff. So I think that some churches and faith communities are actually getting it, but I do hear what you're talking about, right? Like that for so long, there has been this idea that if you suffered from a mental health condition, that meant you didn't have a strong faith walk, so to speak, right? Or that you didn't have a
Right.
strong enough relationship with God or whoever your, faith person is. And so I think that there is still some work to be done to acknowledge that like faith and spirituality and talking with a therapist can coexist. Like it doesn't have to mean you pick one or the other. But I am encouraged to see more churches and faith communities doing more work to encourage mental health support.
I love
Hmm.
that. I'm so curious about you. I'm still stuck on the fact that you were doing the Google Doc or the outline of your list on the early registry yourself. And I'm curious how that's evolved. Like, are you still doing all this? You've got support, right? Like the therapist to me is like, are you
Today's so worried. Are you okay?
Are
I'm
you
like, you're still doing all this, right?
so I am still involved in like a lot of ways with the directory, but they're a team of about 12 of us now. So I'm definitely not still doing
Okay.
all the things on my
Okay.
own. And I think that that was a difficult lesson to learn. Well, one,
Mm.
I feel like I have been like an accidental entrepreneur. Like I always had, like I think many therapists, right? Like I had the full-time job at the counseling center, but then I had like a part-time practice, right? And I felt like that worked well for me. Like that was my dream that eventually I would have like a full-time practice and, kind of be doing my own thing. I never planned to create a business like therapy for Black girls. And so it has been a huge, like, I think, growing pain to kind of figure out
Mhm.
what it means to like be an entrepreneur and to like do this work that I feel is really important, but also like
Mhm.
manage a team and like have to work with a web developer, like all these things that were very, very foreign to me. So I'm
Yeah.
very excited that I now have a team who is incredible and like really is passionate about the work as I am. But it has definitely
Mhm.
been a steep learning curve.
Will you say a little bit more of that? Not, for a friend. I'm just kidding. But like, I think
Asking for a friend.
asking for a friend. But I think that that can be a real growing edge. And
Yeah.
I think that thing of like, when this wasn't necessarily like, I don't know, like pivoting to how to bring in people for support and what that looks like and what your process was around like I feel like for me it's like Vanessa will be like, "Well, maybe we should get some." I'm like, "I don't even know what I need help with. I don't
I
even know
know.
where to start with that." That feels like too much of like a organization or something to wrap my head around that
Well, it's
feels
also like I
overwhelming.
think going back to that superwoman syndrome, right? It's a little bit
Maybe.
of like I can do it all myself, and like I shouldn't need help, or this is I
Yeah.
mean I struggle with that too. Shit, I was in marketing for 10 plus years, and so for me, I'm like I know how to do this. Why can't I do this?
Mhm.
Why can't I do all the things? And so for me, putting down the plates that I actually know how to do is one of the hardest things. But then I get in my own way because obviously it could be better if I could just bring in some damn support.
How did you do it next?
Story of my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the main things, and I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Lovey Ajayi Jones, but she has a
I
podcast called Professional Troublemaker, and this season she
Mm,
has been like doing this beautiful expose on her own business and talking about like how she almost went bankrupt a couple of years
mm,
ago, and one of the things that she talks about is like this ask wound that many of us
mhm.
have. So this whole like getting in our own way and like many of us are so like accomplished and like we can do a lot of things well, but I think that that does leave us in a difficult position when even though you can do the things, is it the best use of your time to be trying to do
That's
all
right.
the things, right? And so I think it has been about me just being honest and vulnerable with people like, I don't know what I'm doing, y'all. Like I need help. And so talking
mm,
with other entrepreneurs who have like connected me to like their developers and like the web team that we have now, I got connected to through Michael, who you may know from Herd, but he was previously at the Gottman Institute, and I was talking with him
mhm,
about like I just really need help with this directory. Like it just is so unwieldy. There's just so many pieces, and so he connected me with our web team, and so I think being able to
mm,
kind of get out of my own way and say, hey, I need help. I don't know what I'm doing here has typically led to people saying, oh, I have a referral for you, right? But I think we
Mhm.
got to be able to kind of take off the cape and like take off the highlight reel and say, I'm struggling. I don't know, for people to actually step up and say, here's a resource. I can help you.
Well, it is. Doesn't that make sense for everything? I mean, even like in our lives, parenting, all of it. It's like being able to take off that cape and saying, "Hey, I'm struggling," and letting somebody say either, "Hey, let me step in and help you," or "Hey, I've got this resource for
mm.
you." I think that lesson can kind of go across the board.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah. You said the words asking wound and I had like a visceral
Yeah, physical reaction.
response in my
You both
body.
did.
And I'm like, "Ugh." I
Shit,
feel
she's a
attacked.
therapist today. She saw it in us.
She's like, "Oh, I saw you."
Oh, I
I saw
saw.
you.
But I think the way you framed it is really helpful because I
Yeah.
don't I don't think a lot of times of myself as being like, on a highlight reel or it just feels like, no, I've got it. And I think there's like a deeply wounded, like, I don't want to burden anyone with
Yep.
whatever this
There it
is. So
is.
like I can figure it out. And I think so many of us as women carry that thing of receiving is still really, really hard.
Yeah, and not only that we don't want to be a burden, but I think sadly for a lot of us, people have weaponized us asking for help against us, right? So this idea
Mhm.
that they've said like, "Oh, you should be able to figure that out," or "I did it on my own, you should be able to do it on your own," right? And so I think when you get that kind of rejection in a response, it does harden you and make you feel like, "Okay, maybe I should figure this out." But I think when you have gotten that kind of feedback, I encourage people to know that it doesn't mean that you were wrong for asking help for help. It just may mean that you were asking the wrong person. And so don't give up
Mm.
asking for help just because you've not gotten it from one particular person.
Dr.
Mm.
Joy's compassion is so like warm and nurturing. All
We need
right,
to
so
tap into it.
right, I'm like a little bit more of that. And so are you at capacity? You don't see clients. in private practice.
I still have one client who like refuses to give up her spot. She's like, I will be as flexible as you need. We will roll with this thing until the wheels fall off. But largely I am only doing like the podcast and directory and like the speaking stuff.
Yeah, so that asking would, right, generationally, I feel like a lot of the older generation still has this very like pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And I think that I see that a lot in clients who are kind of right on this like Gen X, elder millennial cusp, where we're pushing back against that. And then we're getting a lot of feedback about like, you know, being soft, being snowflakes, like not being able to handle the stressors, right? And looking at that generation and being like, how are y'all doing? Because I don't know. When I look at you, I don't know that you're handling the stressors any better than we're handling the stressors.
Yeah, I do think we find ourselves at an interesting time, right? As, you know, older people kind of feeling like we've had to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, but Gen Z and whatever is beyond Gen Z feeling very much like I'm not doing things the way that older generations have done it. Like, I don't want to kind of be in one job for the rest of my life. Like, just acting, I think, with a freedom that is very interesting and liberating, but also I think causes some tension then when they are in the workplace. And so I just think it's fascinating, like how we are going to reconcile all of these different kinds of personalities and thoughts in workplaces and even in our own families. I think we see some of this play out.
Oh, wow. Yes, we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like I'm curious to see like your thoughts on where you think all of this is headed. Like, what do you think are some, I feel like we're living through a very like pivotal moment in history where there's so much about our societal structures that are shifting and some of the, you know, the patriarchal ways of being. But what do you think that looks like in terms of our relationships and just some of the things that you feel like you're supporting people with? Like, how are things changing from your perspective right now?
You know, honestly, Danae, I feel like stuff feels pretty hopeless right now. Like, I think we are post-pandemic or wherever we are in the pandemic, because COVID keeps like changing and like, there's new names. So, you know, it's not over. So whatever this is, not post, but wherever, you know, we know the political scene is incredibly tense. You know, leadership has felt like not actually leading. And I think people are largely kind of just trying to figure stuff out on their own. And so largely, I think people feel very helpless and hopeless. But I think what has been encouraging to me is the way that communities are kind of rallying around each other to say, you know what? All these systems that we thought would be there to kind of catch us if everything fell apart were not there or largely were ineffective.
Yeah.
So we all we got. And so how can we actually pull together to support one another? How can we take care of one another in ways that don't actually rely on these larger systems? And I think that has to happen. But then there has to be another faction of the community that is also trying to like push for change. But I agree with you that it does feel like we are in this major backlash moment is how I think I would describe it. Like, it felt like for a long time there was at least some semblance of like progress and like movement towards more equality and justice, and then it feels like people were like, nope, we actually don't want that. And so, you know, we've already talked a little bit about like white supremacy and like how so much of our systems are actually founded in that. And I feel like that is what we are seeing, is that people are very afraid of kind of losing the power they have had for so long. And so we are seeing this huge backlash, I think, in a lot of the progress that had been made.
That part. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I feel like I've been saying often that it is that like darkest before, and I don't want to say dawn, like I don't know that we're at the end of what is a dark period, but I do think there are so many things about our societal structures that had been just below the surface. Like if you look at, you know, George Floyd being murdered and like everything that happened with the Black Lives Matter conversation in 2020, so often people were like, everything is just so heightened. And I'm like, yes, but all of this had been happening. Like if you lived in New York, like throughout like the night, like there were like stop and frisk laws that were like hella awful racist policies that were just not caught on tape. Like so much of this has been happening forever, ever. We just have the technology to really like have no choice but to witness these things. And, you know, to your point, I think it feels really destabilizing to have all of it coming to the surface and us have to see it like kind of bombarded with it. But also I think it's to make us uncomfortable enough that we sort of like challenge like, have these structures really been keeping us safe and working for all of
Right.
us? Or has it been just sort of the illusion of things being, good? I don't know.
I was thinking too, like Danae, you and I have talked about this, but like my partner and I have had many conversations about this, and he's Korean, but a person of color, and he talks when I kind of get into a space of like being really overwhelmed by it all, or really like where is this all going? It's all bullshit, and I kind of get into my spin a bit, and a lot of times he'll be the one that'll say, I'm really glad that everything is being shown. Like, I'm really glad that social media is putting a light on things, and he has this very I don't know if positive's the right word, but almost like a positive spin on all of the anxieties and all of the things right now that are being brought to light, because he's always like, if it wasn't being brought to light, it wouldn't change. Right. And so while it feels overwhelming, it's almost like a necessary part of that growth that you were talking about today. Like this is like the squeeze, like it feels a bit like right now we're all being squeezed. And what is going to come out on the other side of that? We don't know. But it sure as hell isn't going to look like it did before, because that's impossible. Right. It can't. And so something new is emerging. We just don't know what it looks like. And so while we're all in this kind of liminal space, and as we know, the liminal space is the most uncomfortable space to be in, right? And we're constantly grasping for something that feels like normal. But if everything that's normal is changing, what the hell is normal, right? And so it feels like we're all kind of in this squeeze together, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But I appreciate you saying that. And I think that is a part that like concerns me. That like, yes, I also agree that it is good that we have like evidence, so to speak, right? Like that we are more aware, but I don't think like the human psyche is keeping up with the rate at which like we are aware of all these things all at once. And so, yes, it is important to know about these things, but like, I think people often feel so stuck after like witnessing some of these atrocities, that I don't know like how movement then happens. Like that, I think is the part that still confuses me, is that yes, we want to know about this, but like, how do you pull yourself out of kind of seeing tragedy after tragedy broadcast on your phone?
Which is traumatic. I mean, it puts us into a trauma response, right? And so whether it's secondary or not is not even the point. The point is it's still traumatizing. And so then if you're in that state, you're not going to be in an action state, right? And so how do we reconcile rather like the knowing and the doing? Because sometimes too much knowing actually hinders you from doing, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. I cannot tell you the number of clients I have actually suggested that you don't watch the news, because I don't know that like at some point it just becomes like the consistent traumatization of our psyche for what? I feel powerless. But to the point that you are making, Dr. Joy, I think there's so much that we're understanding the power of community, and that there's so many things that like if we come together, we can figure out how to do some of these things structurally different from like, no, we can start our own version of like, I'm thinking of like, what's that?
The mommies.
But it's just my thoughts for me when I can't think. But I think there's all these ways that in 2020, I was so inspired watching, people had to work and they had their kids home and they had no choice but to get to know their neighbors that they'd never spoken to, because it's like, I have no choice. And I see you have kids and I have kids. Could we split the day in half and I watch your kids while you watch my kids? And to me, that's like, we know how to do this. We know how to come back to this collectivist way of being. It's just sometimes until the heat is turned up, we won't, and we don't feel like we have to. But I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know that it serves us to be in this constant bombardment of like the world is ending. It's like, what do I do with that?
What do I do with it? Yeah, I was thinking too, like even the people that come to our retreats today, I don't know if you feel this way too, but I think like we started doing retreats. I mean, we started doing them online during the pandemic because that was really our only option. And then coming out of the pandemic and being able to kind of come together in community, I think the hunger for even that kind of work, like kind of circling it back to the mental health world, I have seen such an explosion, right, of people desiring to like get out from behind the screen and actually come back together in real life. And the people that come to our retreats, it's so interesting because they really are like all walks of life and, all backgrounds, but everybody's also in it together in the sense of like, we're all trying to elevate kind of the global, consciousness, the global community, whatever that looks like, from our own kind of corners of the globe. And like, what does that look like? And kind of seeking, I suppose, maybe some guidance in how to do that in their own community. Danae and I have talked about how a lot of our retreats have almost started to turn into or evolve into this idea of like leadership retreats that we didn't originally anticipate, mostly women coming together. And it's turned into like, how do we almost like empower you to become leaders then to go back to your own community and carry this work forward, right, for the people around you. And I just feel like that feels similar to what we were saying about community kind of coming forth as like so imperative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, so much of the pandemic, we were kind of forced to be on our screens and like not be in person with one another. There is a real thirst, I think, and hunger for people to connect in person. Definitely the Therapy for Black Girls community has been asking for more in-person events. They don't want to do Zoom anymore. People, I think, are just largely fatigued at like looking at one another in these boxes. And so I think that you're right, that there's a lot of like interest in connecting in real life and connecting, I think, in deeper ways, right? Like I think previously things felt more surface, right? So even if you went to like a networking event or something, like it was just kind of surface, whereas now I think people are actually wanting to connect on a much deeper level.
So are you doing some in-person events from like, so can they?
So can we?
Well, is that an option?
So we are having our first therapist summit in July in Atlanta. And so that's an opportunity for therapists to come together. One, just because I think therapists have been holding so much that I really wanted a place where therapists can kind of let their hair down and like have some fun, but also talk about like how a lot of people are actually feeling very burned out and like looking to maybe even leave the mental health field. And I think that that's a very real conversation. And so we're doing that in July for therapists, and looking at other ways for our non-therapist community to connect in like in their cities, because people want to connect where they are and like meet other people. So we're looking at some other ways probably in the fall to bring our community together in real life.
I love that. You just reminded me of another question I wanted to ask you, because I think that while you have been, as we were talking about, such a pioneering force that I am so grateful for in terms of the directory. And I mean, just looking, I'm not on the directory anymore because I don't have space in my practice, but just, I was on there the other day, like, and how much it's grown from when I first joined in 2020, like blows my mind. And I'm thinking like I'm in Los Angeles, and while there are a lot of therapists in Los Angeles, what must it be like in middle America? And I think there is such still a struggle around finding credentialed mental health professionals. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on around this, because I feel like I'm like blanking on her name right now. Dr. Rachel Martin. Is that Raquel Martin?
Raquel Martin.
Is that how you say her name? I heard her on a reel the other day talking about like all of the issues with Black therapists becoming credentialed, and that like the school and the cost of school and the time and the investment, it's a lot to get to that place where you are actually able to support people. And I'm curious like what your thoughts are on coaches versus therapists, or like if you speak to that often on the podcast, and just like what that brings up for you as you hear me.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a struggle to become like an independently licensed clinician, right? Like you don't just go to school, finish, and like shut up shop and say, hey, I'm available to see clients, right? Like we all know, like you have to take these expensive tests, and then you have to work under somebody else's license and get supervision for like 1 to 3 years before you say, oh, I'm available independently to see clients. So it is quite a process, and none of that is free. Like I said, the test costs, you have to pay your supervisor, like there's just a lot of costs. And so I think, again, when we look at the disparities in all of these fields, I think the mental health field is no different. That cost wise, if you are not from a family that can support that, then what does that mean the field looks like? And I think that largely people of color and Black people are left out because cost wise, it just is not something that families can do. And so I do think that coaches have a place. The concern with coaching, and, I think, there are some like certifications, but I don't know that there are a lot. And I think anybody can kind of call themselves a coach. And I think mostly people mean well. Like I think people typically go into helping kinds of professions like therapy, like coaching, because they want to help people. I think though without the mental health training, you don't know what you don't know. And so you don't know necessarily what you're opening up for people, even if you are well intentioned by calling yourself like a trauma coach or like, well, what does that mean? Like trauma feels very big to me, right? And so even licensed mental health professionals sometimes don't do a great job managing trauma. And so that is my concern, is that people, even though they are well intentioned, may not realize how they can actually be further harming people because they have not been trained to do and have the kinds of conversations with clients that we are as mental health professionals.
Wow. You have certainly done your part and been just such a tremendous resource for just the collective. And so I feel so grateful to have this opportunity to say thank you to you. Certainly my practice was built with your support, and I'm meeting you now. Like, oh yes, today I'm well aware that I supported you in your practice. I'm like, how does she know that? But yeah, I feel like you've done your part in really attempting to be a solution. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. It still is such an honor when I run into random people in the wild who found their therapist in the directory, right? Like just yesterday I was at a library event and like 2 different women came up to me and talked about finding their therapist in the directory. I had a meeting earlier this morning with someone who found her therapist in the directory and has been working with them for the last 6 years. Like it's just such a huge honor that something that started as a Google Doc has like connected so many people with healing in their areas. So it's just a huge honor. And I'm so thankful for all the therapists who took a chance and like listed their directories with me when I had no idea what I was doing. And that it has turned into, something that has been so healing, I think, for lots of people.
It's so beautiful. You in a Google Doc.
I know, I love it. See? It can all start from a Google Doc.
It can all start with a Google Doc.
Hey.
You have no idea where it can go.
Listen, anybody listening who's like on that entrepreneur path, like that is it. You are like the description of what it could be. Start a Google Doc and you don't know where it's going to go.
Yep. Start with what you have. You don't have to put out a lot of money before you know what you're doing. Start with what the resources that are available.
That's it.
Beautiful. All right, Dr. Joy. So we have a lightning round of questions that we ask all of our guests. And the first question is, who have been your greatest teachers, mentors, people who've impacted your path up to this point, whether they're people you know or just their work has really inspired you?
Ooh, so the first person I thought of was my grandmother, just because I feel like a lot of my appreciation for humans and like curiosity about human behavior started with her on our front porch in Louisiana. So I definitely think my grandmother. The work of so many countless Black women mental health professionals who made it okay to kind of focus only on Black women as a community, I think really opened the door for me to do therapy for Black girls. So I would also say them.
Beautiful. Love that. So this kind of concept of flow, right? This thing where we know all of the things align and you blink your eyes and the whole day is gone. Like, what is that for you? What do you find yourself doing when you're in flow?
Oh, so I just got back from a trip to Belize and we took a short cruise across the Caribbean Sea, and I really feel like I resonate with like water, which is very strange because I can't actually swim. So it's a bit of a oxymoron, I think, but I think I feel the most at peace and the most like clear about like whatever is happening if I am near or on a body of water.
Beautiful.
Love that.
I want to go to Belize.
It was beautiful. It was beautiful. I highly recommend.
Danae, next
I'm like,
let's talk about
wheels are turning. I'm like, do we need to go to Belize? I lost my train of thought. Okay. I'm dreaming of Belize. So what breaks your heart, Dr. Joy?
I think what breaks my heart is women not recognizing their worth and not like understanding the value that they bring to their communities and just the world, and kind of playing small, because I think that there are such incredible things that happen when we step into our power. And so I think women not recognizing their worth breaks my heart.
Part. Yeah.
Okay, final question. What is your favorite food?
Ooh, I think pizza. I would have to say pizza. I love it.
Yes, girl, from my own heart.
speaking to the New Yorker over there. You just made her day.
You hear me on a rampage all over Los Angeles. Stop calling this pizza. This isn't pizza. It's not pizza.
Well, Dr. Joy, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to say thank you to you. Not only have you done so much to destigmatize the work that we do and, just really normalize these conversations, but I felt a little bit of something as you were talking about women and recognizing their power. And I think there's so much about what you've built and the permission that you've given women to really sort of step into that space of like, you can do it, just get started. That I've certainly been so inspired by you as a woman. So I really appreciate you and the work that you do in the world. And thank you for coming on and sharing with us a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you both for having me. I enjoyed this conversation with you.
We're going to link everything out. So everybody listening, you'll be able to click through and find all the things. But anybody who doesn't have a pencil and paper or can't click out, where can everybody find you if they're just learning about you now?
So I am at Hello Dr. Joy across all the social media platforms. You can visit my website at hellodrjoy.com, and you can keep up with the work of Therapy for Black Girls at therapyforblackgirls.com.
Love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Joy.
Thank you.